then held his arms out suddenly behind him to be squired and silk-lined into the camel coat. So he's dressing to leave again, and placed into the coat that I think he's being helped into. The verb squired gives quite an interesting take on how it might be pushed and forced into his what sounds like quite an expensive coat after he's done his job there. Just a quick word about the enjambment. If you notice, this is going right through so far between lines and verses, just giving in a sense that in his memory he's rushing all of the observations and images out in a sense of wonder and excitement. So it's got that quite a firm structure to the poem, but the lack of structure that a small child might have when they're watching such events that they see from grown-up world coming into their home. At which point he once turned his eyes upon me, 2 peepholes into the locked room I saw into every time his name was mentioned. This peepholes is quite nice, giving an idea that he's spying through the keyhole, or that he's just got a very tiny, quick image of what is actually happening in the room where his mum's having the baby. Every time his name was mentioned, skimmed milk and ice, swabbed porcelain, the white and chill of tiles. The list of items here move between the natural milk and ice through swabbed porcelain, white chill of tiles, to more man-made, almost scientific or hospital-like laboratory kind of objects. The chill of chill of tiles has a nice sense of touch about it, of cold. Steel hooks, chrome surgery tools. Chrome's like a shiny metal that is often used to cover other forms of metal. And blood dreeps in the sawdust, where it thickened at the foot of each wall. So this is quite grotesque, this blood dreeps. The invented verb dreeps, seeps and drips, I think it's supposed to be a joining of those two words. And this idea of blood pouring into sawdust, which I think was, and maybe still is, used to soak up blood. So you're getting this really disgusting image of almost like a slaughterhouse, perhaps, or something gruesome happening, where it thickened at the foot of each cold wall. And overhead the little pendant, teat-hued infant parts, strung neatly up from a line up near the ceiling, a toe, a foot and shin, an arm, a cock, a bit like the rosebud in his buttonhole. So what's going on here, structurally, we've moved from the narrative of the doctor coming to birth the baby and he's watching him and preparing the water, or he's watching his dad or somebody prepare the water, to going into his own imagination or hallucinations about how these babies come about. And this is where you see that it's got some disgusting images, but it's quite charming as well, because he believes that he and his brothers and sisters came in the doctor's bag. That's how they were brought into the family. The doctor came with a bag and pulled them out of his bag. So he's saying that he's imagining parts of babies' bodies being assembled almost in some sort of factory where they'll put together all of these parts of an infant that are hanging on hooks together, and then the doctor will join them and this will be the new baby. The teat-hued infant parts, the teat is where the mother will feed the baby. The hued is the colour, so I'm imagining it's a very sort of luxurious pinky, beigey skin colour. And they're all lined up, hanging from hooks, ready to be placed together. A toe, a foot and shin, an arm, a cock, a bit like the rosebud in his buttonhole. And then you've got that simile as well of the flower, another image of the natural world, but this time much more for decorative purposes that this doctor can use. So he's got this image of the doctor as some sort of magician who can make these little babies. 2. Poetica Doctus, Peter Levi says, sanctuaries of Asclepius, called Asclepions, were the equivalent of hospitals in ancient Greece. Okay, we've got a very strong change of tone and subject matter in part 2. Here we've got the idea Heaney is putting forward that, this is one idea of interpretation, that the idea of poetry can be very much linked to the idea of making babies, because they're both incredibly life-affirming, beautiful, very powerful, healing products and properties. So he's drawing a connection between the Doctor and Peter Levi, who was a poet and a writer and a Jesuit priest. Now, Jesuits are only men from within the Catholic Church who are taught and trained from childhood to be very, very pious, good, extremely hardworking, very, very academic, and studying a great deal. And this Peter Levi was a Jesuit. Sanctuaries of Asclepius. Now, Asclepius was part of the ancient Greek world, and it was a temple that had a lot of hospital-like places and medicine and so forth around it. And Asclepius, the god of medicine, developed out of a much earlier cult of Apollo as the official cult of Epidaurus. Now, Epidaurus is a similar word to epidural, which is a very powerful injection ladies get today when they're in labour to ease the pain of labour. The Temple of Asclepius was the most celebrated healing centre of the classical world and consisted of a theatre and hospital buildings devoted to its healing gods. And Apollo was a Greek god, considered the god of healing and medicine. So there's lots of connections he's drawing here to this little baby being born in his home and the ancient Greek world of medicine and healing, giving an idea of the permanency of life, of the connections throughout history, and the very, very powerful and learned doctors, people who can give this gift along to humankind. A sanctuary is a place of safety. Sanctuaries of Asclepius, called Asclepions, were the equivalent of hospitals in ancient Greece, or of shrines like Lourdes, says Poeta Doctus Graves. Lourdes is a famous place in France that is second in tourism each year, only to Paris, and this is a place of pilgrimage for many Christians, and it is a place where the Virgin Mary was supposed to appear to people throughout points in history, and it is a place that's believed to have a great many healing properties. So people who are often very sick will go to Lourdes even today. And Poetic Doctus Graves, that's Robert Graves, who's a very famous writer and poet. I think he's passed on as well. He wrote I Claudius, which is probably his most famous work. Or of the cure by poetry that cannot be coerced, say I, who realised at Epidaurus that the whole place was a sanatorium where theatre and gymnasium and baths, a site of incubation, where incubation, and we'll take the next line in a moment, but for now, the cure by poetry that cannot be coerced, say I. So this is Heaney professing his passionate belief that poets and poetry have immense healing powers, just the same as doctors of the physical body. And that sort of connection and that ability to, I would say, heal people's souls and minds and hearts, as well as their more physical selves. There's also an idea that the concept of him being aware this baby's being born and poets and how they might work, there's a lot of invisibility or things not being completely obvious or completely seen here. Lots of hidden secrets that the doctors and the poets will work very hard to bring out into the world. So the poets might birth their poems and their ideas and the beauty of their words, just as the doctor, as far as when he was a child, thought would make little babies. Say I, who realised that Epidaurus at Epidaurus, which was a place where this temple was, that the whole place was a sanatorium, a very clean and pristine place where people would go to recover from illnesses, a sanatorium, with theatre and gymnasium and baths. The ancient Greeks and Romans thought baths had greatly healing properties. A site of incubation, and incubation is a very nice warm box sort of area or room where premature babies or small babies will be kept to help them grow. It's a very safe place for them, and little eggs will be incubated so they can hatch into chicks as well.